Every morning, the team at the Exchange meets to discuss what we think the top stories of the day should be and then why. Here's a look behind closed doors at what we think makes the cut. The first story is about an industry that helps British Columbia pay off its debt, potentially, or one that never gets off the ground. That's what's hanging over BC officials as they announce proposed tax rates for liquefied natural gas projects. When our team discussed it this morning, we wondered if tax changes are really going to be enough to entice companies and to build momentum for the LNG industry in this country.
I think it's a key element of the puzzle for these large investors that are going to make a decision about whether or not that industry is going to get off the ground.
We talk about LNG in this country as though it exists, and it's not only does not exist, but the prospect of it never existing is very real.
And yet there is a big push to create an industry sort of from scratch, which we kind of want to do.
For a little while there, it looked like we were going to be complete lemmings and just get our terminals built, if we ever got them built, just in time for China to have a shale gas explosion. Now it turns out that the Chinese shale gas is not actually particularly easy to drill. The economics may have just swung back in favor of LNG.
It takes so long.
They do take so long, and we're nowhere. How to keep companies interested in an industry that's struggling to gain a foothold on our shores is not the only concern. The BC government needs residents on board, of course, something the Environment Minister there is keenly aware of.
To ensure we have the cleanest LNG facilities in the world, we are introducing an emissions benchmark with flexible options, including the purchase of offsets, as well as technology fund contributions. This is the most effective way to meet the province's climate goals while ensuring industry competitiveness.
We're getting into the heart of corporate earnings season here. So far, there have been some gloomy projections. Last week, we heard from Walmart. It said growth over the next few years would be much slower than thought. Yesterday, IBM said it would miss its target for next year, too. Well, today, it was Coca-Cola's turn. Its profit for this year is also going to fall short. Coca-Cola profit dropped 14% in the quarter that it's reporting. The company blames some of that on currency fluctuations as overseas profit is repatriated back into the U.S. with a suddenly strong dollar. It also reported lower sales in North America as consumers bought fewer carbonated drinks, energy drinks, and juices. The company hopes to cut its way to growth, though. It's increasing its plans to cut costs by $3 billion. That's up from $1 billion announced earlier this year. Meanwhile, over at McDonald's, there was also a struggle to show sales growth. Globally, sales were down 3.8% in September. Some places were worse than others. In the U.S., McDonald's is having a tough time keeping younger customers interested in its menu. In Europe, weakness in Russia, Ukraine, and Germany took a toll on same-store sales. The even bigger drag, though, was the company's Asia-Pacific decision. It struggled to build back confidence, especially in China, after a supplier there was accused of selling McDonald's expired meat. That played a big role in a 30% drop in profit in third quarter. That was worse than what analysts expected, and it surprised our team, too. I'm still flabbergasted that this is the reaction to the tainted food scandal.
They're not necessarily seen by everyone as the health choice,
right?
But a large Western corporate entity, I think, is seen as a clean, not going to make me sick choice.
The sales drop in Asia is 10%, but still globally it's 3%. So you can't tie it completely to that.
A double-digit sales decline for this company is unheard of.
My first job was at McDonald's.
Do you think your last job will be too?
It may well be. It was very strict. For something like this to happen, like something went really wrong.
So when you damage your brand that way, how long do they stay damaged?
How do they try to get it back on track, and can you?
New numbers from the U.S. paint a stark picture on household wealth and perhaps serve a warning sign as well. According to Credit Suisse, the ratio of household wealth to incomes in the United States is at the highest level since the Great Depression. As you can see, spikes of this magnitude took place around 2006, 2000, and 1935. Why do we care? While a higher ratio of wealth to income could be cause for concern. If those dates sound ominous to you, you're thinking the same way that the bankers at Credit Suisse were. The report included a chart that read, "This is a worrying signal given that abnormally high wealth-income ratios have always signaled recessions in the past." And that got us thinking about the significance of the numbers.
I haven't seen that before, that this measurement of wealth to income would be used as a predictor of recession.
Because they talk about since the Great Depression, but it continued to rise right through up until about the mid-1930s, and the Depression was well underway by then.
It does make sense, though, that when that disparity is growing, it's because incomes are stagnating or falling, which would lead to drops in consumer spending and confidence, and therefore recessions. What starts that and what finishes it is a good question. Well, the line on the chart's dramatic. Keep this in mind. While these ratios have always preceded recessions, not all recessions are preceded by this kind of spike. The CBC's Peter Armstrong here. We talk a lot, Peter, about income disparity.
Yep.
In this case, the increase in average household wealth in America is enormous. It's really gone up, and you could look at that number and say, well, that's a good thing. What we know, of course, is that when you dig deeper, it's gone up because of two things: rising stock prices and increased value in homes. And most Americans' wages have not gone up.
And I think that's the real issue here. It's not the top line so much as it is the bottom line. The top line has its concerns, and we've talked about those. But the bottom line of, the wage increases and the cost of living matching that, that's where the concern is. And I think, the question is for central bankers, for policymakers, what do you do to raise that bar? And I think they've tried a whole lot of things since the recession in 2008, and none of them have really worked to do that. We have seen some job growth, we have seen some wage growth, but it's been really stagnant, it's been really slow. And I think, the thing for me that comes out of this are two real stark narratives. And one is that, hey, things are getting better. The job numbers are coming out. We're doing all right.
Yeah.
People are making more money. The other are all these indicators, and you talked about them earlier. The Coke figures, the earnings reports from these guys that are titans that used to be a sure bet aren't making their mark. This kind of stuff is feeding into a fear that you see everywhere.
So kind of confidence driven. We should note that we talk about that stagnating middle class income, and it is a much more dire picture in the U.S. than in Canada. We do tend to kind of muddle the two together because we get so much of our news from America.
And in fact,
it's not as bad here.
The report from Credit Suisse has a whole page on just Canada and says that it's not nearly as dramatic. It has its issues, but it's not nearly as dramatic.
But the thing it highlights that I think is one of the big structural problems that we face, that we've talked a lot about on the show, and I feel like we're going to be talking about this for years, is that we do have wealth being created by businesses, profit, and it isn't turning into higher wages for laborers. And that's kind of creating this conundrum in the world where, the rich are getting richer because they are investors in businesses that are profitable, but that isn't, for the first time, it's not turning into an expansive economy for everybody.
And the thing that sort of comes from that I think is important is this, the through line to all this is, how do you try to get businesses to spend more? They're sitting on these piles of cash. There's so many sort of ways that this intersects with almost every problem in the economy that this is just one of those sort of highlighting all of them. But yeah, you've got these companies that aren't investing. That's not sort of turning around to new jobs. It's not boosting the wages of people. And, we've got Stephen Poloz and the Bank of Canada making their announcement on interest rates tomorrow. The fact is the central bankers just don't have their sort of tools to try, they're out of tools that they've used to try to boost this, to try to change this, and try to turn it around.
Yeah.
It's unclear what anybody can do to try to lift, as I say, that
Well, one of the
bottom
things
line.
that I think we've seen very little imagination on is the parts of our economies, and this is true for both Canada and the U.S., although you could argue more for the U.S., that we choose to stoke. And so in America, financial services is now an outsized part of the economy, even as real industries shrink and shrink. And the housing market, even here in Canada, the housing and housing-related industries are now just a mammoth share of GDP. And it's sort of terrifying because you ask yourself, is that really a productive thing that we build a house? Yeah, you can live in it, but it's not as though you've created something that has a long-lasting legacy.
And I think from a policy perspective, how on earth do you try to dissect that and start to change it? Because once you sort of started to go down that road, like to try to change that policy in the States where financial services is as big as it is, I don't know how you do that. And here in Canada it's less pronounced, but it is as big an issue. How do you try to spread
Well, what's
that
so
around?
interesting is the way you do it is you let them blow themselves up, right? Every now and then, an industry
and
will
maybe
blow it.
that's what we're seeing
well,
here.
we almost saw it, and instead of letting themselves blow themselves up and letting financial services shrink back down to,
we save them.
We save them and make them even bigger, and now it's an industry.
And now they're
bigger
big
than ever.
again, and they're artificially big, not only because we saved them, but because of quantitative easing, all of the things that are sort of artificially floating that market. It'll be interesting to see, if ever we get to see, what it'll look like without that.
So, and I think also this conversation is important to have always in the context of the globe, don't you? Because we do talk about kind of the middle class stagnating in America and the income disparity and how, is the American dream dead? It's still better to be middle class in America than almost anywhere in the world.
For sure. And, despite all the talk about it here, it's pretty good to be in the middle class in Canada, too.
Yes.
So, yeah, you look at, I would way rather be in the middle class in Canada, the United States, than in Europe Europe or in China right now because the economies there are a lot more volatile.
Yeah, although if we don't solve these problems, you know, you've got kids, I've got a son,
Good.
I don't want to leave a legacy of declining standard of life, which is what we're poised to do right now. So we do have to figure this out.
And, you know, the bar can't be, well, we're doing better than everybody else. The bar needs to be, how are we doing? Is our economy as healthy as it can and should be? And I think what all of this is pointing at is no, it's not. And there are steps that we should be taking. The question is,
What's interesting to me, though, is that in history, when we have seen great redistributions and wages increase, which actually isn't the norm, right? Throughout the long history, wages didn't increase.
Sure.
We made them increase through policies that directed them to increase.
That forced it up, yeah.
So the question is why we're so afraid. I know in America why they're afraid. It's because they've got crazy campaign finance rules. But I don't know why in a country like ours or in places in Europe, we don't actually look at serious policies that say, take your profit, raise the wages, or reinvest it. You know, I'm not saying that the government could run industry, but
Sure.
you could set policy.
And I think it's the reason that everything's sort of out of whack right now is because it's fear. People are afraid of change, even though things are pretty, you know, maybe not as good as they should be. They're not as dramatically bad as they could be. So let's not stir the pot too much.
Thanks, Peter.
You bet.